Sorry. Can you hear me okay like that? Yeah, okay. So I'd like to thank Dietmar for inviting me here. It's a great honor and pleasure. I actually got my start here at Northeastern University. This was the first place I ever gave an invited academic talk. And I was invited to the criminology department by Professor Nicole Rafter, who you may know passed away this spring. So for a talk on visual images of criminality, so it's not unrelated to what we're talking about here. So the fingerprint, both the word and the image, are sort of incredibly powerful and efficient signs. The word itself serves sort of effortlessly as a metaphor for a certain kind of a relationship between a trace and an object. When we use metaphors like chemical fingerprints or electronic fingerprints, we are, in a sense, using a term for which we have no substitute. What word would we use if we didn't have the word fingerprint to convey those ideas? What words did we use when the fingerprint itself was new and we didn't have the word fingerprint? Well, it turns out we used words like signature or portrait, and those words come close, but I think sort of lack quite the depth and the power of the word fingerprint. And what we usually mean by the word is, and the image of the fingerprint, is indexicality, the notion of not just a relationship between a trace and the object, in the case of the fingerprint, the object being a body, but a one-to-one relationship, as Dietmar mentioned a little bit in his introductory remarks. A claim that only one body could have produced that fingerprint. So if we look up here, we often use the word fingerprint to mean a variety of different things. We often talk about the fingerprints on our skin, but that's in the discipline, that's not strictly correct. That's called friction-ridged skin. And fingerprints are impressions of friction-ridged skin, and they can be inked, or what used to be called inked impressions and are now scanned impressions, deliberately taken impressions, or they can be what are usually called latent impressions, that is, accidental impressions like the ones that we're leaving on objects all the time. And the claim is that there is sort of a unique one-to-one link between those impressions and back to the friction-ridged skin itself. The opposite claim, the reverse claim, that each body can only produce one fingerprint, is a little bit of a trickier claim. In a trivial sense, it's of course not true. Most bodies produce 10 fingerprints, to say nothing of all kinds of impressions of toes, soles, palms, and anatomical areas. But in addition, and this is an important point I'll return to later, every area of friction-ridged skin is actually capable of producing an infinite number of impressions or fingerprints through the vagaries of distortion. And that's what this slide is meant to show, that you can have, in fact, not only are no two areas of friction-ridged skin identical, but no two impressions of any area of friction-ridged skin are in fact identical. They are, in a sense, all different, which raises questions about this claim of sort of indexicality. So nonetheless, this supposed one-to-one correspondence between the trace and the body makes the fingerprint perhaps one of the archetypal examples of what in Peirce's semiotics is called an index. And some of you may be familiar with Carlo Ginzburg's classic essay in the semiotics book, The Sign of Three, on the connections between detection and semiotics, where he explores this. The fingerprint is interesting in a way among forensic technologies, some of which have already been talked about today, in that the thing that forensic scientists look at is in fact the trace itself. Something that's not true of DNA, of forensic DNA profiles, which are in some sense processed traces, where the thing that forensic scientists look at does not at all look like the trace itself. And I can't help bringing forward an image that you saw very, very recently, where Paul Vanus kind of turns this idea on its head, where that processed genetic trace does have kind of a surface meaning that you can read. And so this is true of the fingerprint image as well. So if the fingerprint is an indexical sign, these signs are of course expected to speak, and our symposium here is concerned with the role of design in framing how these traces speak to us. I've argued that the fingerprint has historically been asked to speak in three primary ways, which I've called the archival, the forensic, and the diagnostic. So I'll go quickly through these three types. The archival treats the fingerprint as an index whose object is the archive, a set of bureaucratic records containing ordered impressions of fingerprints. And this process was based on categorizing fingerprints into pattern types. Again, as Dietmar mentioned in his opening remarks, Francis Galton took the first steps in developing this typology. Some of you may know enough about this to know that there are classically either 3 or 4, depending on how you count them, basic fingerprint pattern types: the arch, the loop, and the whorl. Historically, this process was actually a bit more complicated. Galton didn't just come up with these 3 pattern types. In fact, as Galton tried to create pattern types, he kept finding patterns between the basic types, and then he kept creating new pattern types until he ended up with 56 pattern types, and then realized that his system of categorizing patterns was going to be useless. And so it was later bureaucrats who then sort of distilled his system back down to the 3 pattern types. But the 3 pattern types are really reliant on a set of arbitrary rules that the classifiers come up with for distinguishing a loop from a whorl. So there are patterns that are really unclear as to whether they're loops or whorls. It's self-evident. You just have to give the classifiers a set of rules to classify them. So they're not natural kinds in that sense. After nearly a century, however, this process has become mechanized, and now in some sense the index is no longer the fingerprint at all, but a template. And I got to skip ahead a little bit. A template of measured distances between minutiae points, or the location of friction ridge features in Cartesian space. And the object is a database of such templates. So this is how automated fingerprint systems see fingerprints today. That this is all they really see are the points in Cartesian space. The forensic use treats the fingerprint as an index whose object is a body. And I think I need to go backwards for these. Yeah. That's the one. For the index to become evidence, it needs to link to some specific body. This too is changing. Are being developed to derive information from fingerprint traces in and of themselves, even without an object body. So one interesting development is so-called lifestyle forensics, in which you wouldn't even care what the fingerprint pattern is or or try to link it with a specific person, but you would chemically analyze the oils in the fingerprint and find out maybe gender or lifestyle attributes such as drug and tobacco use, chemical exposures, things like that. This is kind of similar to the effort in DNA profiling that was alluded to by Heather, I forget her last name, where you are trying to generate the profile of a donor of a DNA trace absent a comparison profile of a person of interest. And there's an interesting kind of material aspect there to this kind of analysis of the chemical attributes of the oil that makes the fingerprint. A fingerprint that comes from touch is sort of here and material in this room in a way that that fingerprint is not. It has a certain depth to it, even if it's a very kind of shallow depth that projected image, for example, doesn't have. And then we come to the diagnostic. Again, you've seen this image recently. The diagnostic treats the fingerprint as an index whose object is something else. Some characterological attribute, which could be gender, race, ethnicity, disease propensity, behavioral attributes like mental health. It is, in a sense, to paraphrase the remarks that Dietmar quoted earlier this morning, where the meaningless becomes meaningful. This is the least well-remembered use of the fingerprint. In the late 19th and early 20th century, efforts abounded to use fingerprint patterns to predict race, ethnicity, mental illness, to link fingerprint patterns to evolutionary history by comparing the fingerprint patterns of primate species, to use fingerprint patterns to make actuarial predictions in the insurance industry, much in the way that people worry that genetic information today will be used. And here's one example of a kind of evolutionary hierarchy of fingerprint patterns in which argued that the whorl pattern is the least highly evolved because it's the most useful for gripping tree branches. And the arch pattern, where the ridges go straight across, is therefore the least useful for grip and therefore the most highly evolved. Europeans had exactly the opposite theory, which was the whorl pattern was more complex and therefore more highly evolved. Over the course of the 20th century, a discourse arose in which it was claimed that this diagnostic usage was impossible, that fingerprint patterns contained no information, that they could not be used in this predictive fashion. And from this arose the notion of the fingerprint as neutral, as being, for example, race-free, as in this image by Margaret Poffely, which seems to suggest that you can't tell whether somebody's race from their fingerprint pattern. And this is what convinced Paul Rabinow in his famous essay, Galton's Regret, that Jens quoted, that there was that fingerprints were, in a sense, neutral, contained no information. In semiotics terms, the claim is that the fingerprint is a rigid designator. It referred to the originating body or the corresponding archival record, but nothing else, nothing characterological. In more colloquial terms, it might be said that the index failed to speak, that it had nothing to say. I've argued, however, that this discourse was a historical construction. It is not impossible to make the fingerprint speak about race and ethnicity. It's just not very helpful or useful, and the correlations are not very strong. So correlations between fingerprint patterns and gross phenotypic races were observed in the late 19th century, and they continue to be observed today. Those are the basis for the claim that a few years ago that Leonardo da Vinci's mother was, quote, an Arab rather than an Italian. This comes from a fingerprint found on one of da Vinci's canvases. And it's interesting to look at what is behind this claim, right? That fingerprint is then assigned to a pattern type. Something is known about the frequency of those pattern types among gross phenotypic races, which are obviously socially constructed races. Somebody makes some kind of a decision as to where Arab fits in those races, which isn't clear to me, and somewhere different than Italian. And then based on the frequency of that pattern type, some claim is made. That may mean it's more likely that da Vinci's mother belonged to this socially constructed race, but it certainly doesn't mean that she did. Right? It's a probabilistic claim in a certain sense. Fingerprints aren't empty in that way. It's just that 20th century science wasn't able to get the fingerprint to say very much that was very useful in terms of making predictions, compared, for example, to what 20th century science could get genes to say. However, the notion of the fingerprint as a rigid designator, as containing no information about the donor of that fingerprint, became a very powerful and useful rhetorical argument in the dissemination of fingerprint archives as seemingly a safe method of criminal and personal identification because it didn't contain anything about the people in it. And you can see the traces of this rhetorical argument today in the debates over genetic databases in which the refrain, genes are nothing like fingerprints, much more dangerous information is heard repeatedly. So I want to talk a little bit now about the use of the fingerprint and indexicality in forensic science and evidence. Contemporary forensic discourse is rife with claims that various forms of forensic evidence, quote, for themselves. Fingerprints, handwriting, linguistic patterns, gait, all supposedly speak for myself or themselves. Or my favorite, the arson investigators claim, the fire speaks to me from the charred remains of the burnt room. This is, of course, wrong on levels. Legally, evidence never speaks for itself and must always be spoken for, usually by an expert witness. This Thomas Keenan, a practitioner of forensic aesthetics, which would be of interest to this group, argues is the distinction between data and evidence. But more fundamentally, compelling the fingerprint to speak requires elaborate apparatuses which are often minimized in the portrayal of the fingerprint as an index. So I want to talk a little bit about those apparatuses. The understanding of the fingerprint as an index gives the appearance that the one-to-one correspondence between trace and body is an easy and self-evident thing. In fact, it's something that must be worked at and achieved. Generally, the fingerprint's indexicality is said to be a product of something called uniqueness, the claim that no two fingerprints are alike. But even this simple statement that you hear very often, no two fingerprints are alike, is a distortion. As I mentioned, the claim is not that no two fingerprints are alike. No two areas of friction-rich skin are alike, and fingerprints can take an infinite variety of forms. Second, the claim could only possibly be true if what we mean by alike is in fact exactly alike, because we know very well that many areas of friction-rich skin are in fact very much alike. What is being claimed instead is that even these very much alike areas of friction-rich skin are not exactly the same. In fact, I would argue that when people say no two fingerprints are alike or all fingerprints are unique, they do not actually mean either of those things at all, in part because these statements, if understood literally, would do nothing to establish the reliability of fingerprint identification. Rather, what they mean by these phrases is precisely indexicality. They mean precisely the claim that a fingerprint can only be traced to one body, and the reverse claim that one body can only produce fingerprints that can be traced to it. And again, I think this indexicality is much more constructed than people think. First, by claiming that a particular fingerprint can only be caused by a single body requires elaborate apparatuses for finding that body. One is the database, that for most of the 20th century was searched manually using a different kind of index, different meaning of the word index, for classifying fingerprint patterns, and now is searched computer algorithms. Another is the police investigative apparatus for locating a suspect body who might be the source of a particular trace. These apparatuses might yield a body that looks like it might be the source of a particular trace. However, it's recently been made clear that another apparatus is necessary for these to become evidence: probability. One must evaluate the relative probability of seeing these similarities between the trace and the body, if the body is the source of the trace and if some other body is the source. And this, in turn, requires knowing something about the relative rarity of the features that you're looking at in some population, possibly the world population. And it turns out we know almost nothing about that rarity yet. And finally, in the minute or so I have left, I want to talk a little bit about new developments and how those might impact ways of thinking about thinking through indexical design through fingerprints. So new software, for example, attempts to sort of model precisely the distortion between two fingerprint images produced by the same friction-ridged skin. So this software, I see Jens's fly is up here, if some of you have noticed. So this software essentially shows the forensic scientist the distortion that would be necessary to occur if these two fingerprints did in fact come from the same source. So they actually sort of, in a sense, make manifest the distortion that was necessary for them to come to the same source, and then they ask the forensic scientist, do you think this distortion can occur? And they have to sort of think that through for themselves. So that may be a new way of thinking about this indexical relationship. So thank you.
So I'd ask our panel